The antique dealer offered me $300 for my grandmother's wedding ring. I watched from the dusty corner of my own living room as he held it up to the light, dismissing nearly a century of love and commitment as decent condition, nothing special. My daughter Claire nodded eagerly, already calculating how to split the money with her brother Marcus. Neither of them saw me standing there in the shadows of the hallway, watching my own estate sale unfold while I was supposedly 6 feet under at Riverside Cemetery. I should have stayed dead. It would have been easier than learning the truth about the people I'd spent my entire life loving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Whitmore, and 3 weeks ago, I made the most reckless decision of my 72 years. I faked my own death to see who would actually mourn me. The idea came to me on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, sitting in Dr. Patterson's office after another round of tests that showed nothing particularly wrong with me except the inevitable erosion that comes with age. My blood pressure was slightly elevated, my cholesterol needed monitoring, and my knees protested whenever I climbed stairs. But I was healthy enough to live another decade or more, barring any unforeseen complications. The problem wasn't my physical health. It was the growing sense that I had become invisible in my own life, a supporting character in a story that had once been mine. My husband Gerald had passed away 4 years earlier, leaving me alone in the sprawling Victorian house we'd purchased in 1978, when Marcus was just a baby. The house had been full of life back then, full of children's laughter and dinner parties and the comfortable chaos of a family building memories together. Now it echoed with emptiness, too large for one woman who spent most of her days reading in the sunroom or tending the garden that had become my primary companion. Claire lived 15 minutes away with her husband and 2 teenagers, but I saw her perhaps once a month when she needed something. Usually money, though she dressed it up in concerned phone calls about my well-being and suggestions that I should think about downsizing to something more manageable. Marcus had moved to California 12 years ago and called dutifully every Sunday evening, conversations that lasted exactly 7 minutes and covered the same topics week after week. The weather, his job in software development, my health, his assurances that he'd visit soon though he never did. I had friends, of course, women my age who met for book club on the first Thursday of each month, and occasionally organized lunch outings to the new restaurants downtown. But even those relationships felt performative somehow, maintained more out of habit than genuine connection. We discussed novels we barely finished reading and complained about our various ailments and agreed that the world was changing too quickly, but nobody really knew each other anymore. We'd all become too polite, too careful, too afraid of imposing or revealing too much. The catalyst for my decision came during what was supposed to be a family dinner at Claire's house. I'd driven over on a Saturday evening, bringing the homemade apple pie that had been Gerald's favorite, and that I still made out of muscle memory and lingering grief. Claire greeted me at the door with a distracted hug, already talking on her phone about some crisis at work that apparently couldn't wait until Monday. Her husband Tom nodded at me from the living room where he was watching a football game with their son, and their daughter was upstairs in her room, too absorbed in whatever teenagers do with their devices to come down and say hello to her grandmother. I sat at their dining room table for 2 hours, listening to Claire talk about a colleague who'd wronged her and Tom's opinions about the terrible officiating in the game he'd been watching and absolutely nothing about anything I cared about or anything they wanted to know about me. Nobody asked about my week or my garden, or the historical biography I'd been reading. When I mentioned that I'd been thinking about taking a watercolor class at the community center, Claire said that sounded nice without looking up from her phone, and the conversation immediately moved on to something else. Driving home that night, I realized with stunning clarity that I could disappear tomorrow, and it would take them days to notice. Maybe longer. They loved me in the abstract way people love elderly relatives who are expected to eventually die, but whose actual lives have become mostly irrelevant to the forward momentum of the family. I was a placeholder, a name on a Christmas card list, a person to call on birthdays out of obligation rather than genuine desire to connect. The thought that followed was both terrible and irresistible. What if I did disappear? What if I died and could somehow watch how they reacted? Would they mourn me sincerely, or would they simply go through the motions of grief while privately feeling relieved that the obligation of caring about an aging mother had been lifted from their shoulders? And more importantly, What would they do with my house and my possessions and the modest but comfortable inheritance Gerald and I had built over 40 years of careful saving and sensible investing? The plan took shape slowly over the next 2 weeks. I started by visiting my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Hendricks who'd handled Gerald's estate and understood the complexities of family dynamics better than most therapists. I told her I wanted to make some changes to my will and set up a trust that wouldn't be executed until certain conditions were met. Patricia listened with the patient attention she gave all her clients, making notes and asking clarifying questions without judgment. Then I visited my doctor under the pretense of discussing advanced directives and end-of-life planning. Dr. Patterson seemed pleased that I was being proactive about such matters, and we had a long conversation about my wishes should I become incapacitated. I made sure he documented everything carefully, including my request that no extreme measures be taken to prolong my life if my quality of life had deteriorated beyond reasonable recovery. It was all perfectly legitimate planning that any responsible 72-year-old woman might undertake. But it also laid the groundwork for what I was about to do. The hardest part was finding someone I could trust to help me execute the plan. I couldn't tell Claire or Marcus obviously, and my book club friends would have thought I'd lost my mind. That's when I remembered Angela Morrison, a woman I'd known tangentially through volunteer work at the Historical Society. Angela was 68, recently widowed herself, and possessed the kind of practical irreverence that suggested she might understand why someone would want to do something as absurd as fake their own death. I invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant on the edge of town where nobody we knew would see us. Over salads and iced tea, I laid out my plan with as much dignity as I could muster while describing something completely insane. Angela listened without interrupting, her intelligent gray eyes studying my face as if trying to determine whether I was serious or experiencing some kind of breakdown. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "I think it's brilliant. Not because I condone deception, Dorothy, but because sometimes the only way to see the truth is to remove yourself from the equation entirely. People perform for the living but reveal themselves around the dead." I nearly cried with relief that someone understood. Angela agreed to help me on one condition. If what I discovered was too painful, if my family proved to be as callous as I feared, I had to promise I would actually live my life differently afterward rather than simply returning to the same patterns of invisibility and disappointment. Promised. The mechanics of faking a death are more complicated than mystery novels suggest, but also more possible than you'd think. I couldn't actually file a death certificate without committing serious fraud, but I could create a believable scenario that would convince my family I died, while giving me time to observe their reactions before any official documentation needed to happen. The key was timing and a willing accomplice in the form of Angela, who would play the role of concerned friend reporting my death. I spent a week preparing my house for what would come next. I wrote letters to both of my children, sealed them in envelopes marked to be opened after my death, and left them in obvious places where they'd be found. I organized my important papers in labeled folders, making it easy for whoever sorted through my affairs to find bank statements, insurance policies, property deeds, and the various documents that constitute proof of a life lived. I even prepared a guest room with fresh linens and stocked the refrigerator, knowing that Claire and Marcus would probably stay at the house while making arrangements. On Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks ago, I drove to Angela's house with 2 suitcases containing everything I'd need for an extended absence. Clothes, toiletries, books, my laptop, and the few pieces of jewelry I actually cared about, including my own wedding ring and the pearls Gerald had given me on our 25th anniversary. Angela had a finished basement apartment that her son had used during college, and she'd prepared it for my temporary residence with touching thoughtfulness. Fresh flowers on the dresser, good coffee in the kitchen area, and a stack of mystery novels on the bedside table. Then I called Claire from Angela's phone, disguising my voice slightly by speaking more softly and slowly than usual. I told her I was Angela Morrison, a friend of her mother's from the Historical Society, and I was calling with terrible news. I'd stopped by Dorothy's house that morning to pick her up for a volunteer meeting and found her collapsed in the garden. The ambulance had taken her to County General, but she'd been pronounced dead on arrival. A massive heart attack, the paramedics said. Quick and probably painless if that was any comfort. I listened to Claire's stunned silence through the phone, followed by her shocked questions and eventual tears, and felt the first wave of guilt about what I was doing. But I didn't stop. Angela made similar calls to Marcus and to my attorney Patricia, setting in motion the machinery of mourning and estate settlement. Then we waited to see what would happen next. The first 24 hours were exactly what I'd expected. Claire came to the house within an hour of getting the call, and I watched from Angela's car parked discreetly down the street as my daughter walked through the front door I'd left unlocked for precisely this purpose. She stayed for 3 hours, and when she emerged her eyes were red from crying. Marcus called her from California, and they had a long conversation on the front porch that I couldn't hear but could see in her gestures and expressions. Shock, grief, the administrative panic that comes with sudden death. All perfectly normal. All exactly what a loving daughter should feel. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Marcus time to fly in from California, and giving Claire time to make arrangements with the funeral home. I'd left detailed instructions in my letters about my preferences.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
A simple service at Morrison Funeral Home cremation, a small reception afterward at the house. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would burden my children with unnecessary expense or complicated logistics. I'd even prepaid for most of it years ago, another piece of responsible planning that now served my secret purpose. Angela attended the funeral as my friend and unofficial spy, reporting back to me afterward about everything that had happened. The turnout was modest but respectable, she told me. About 40 people, mostly my book club friends and neighbors and a few distant relatives who'd made the trip out of obligation. Claire had spoken beautifully about growing up with a mother who'd always been there for her, who'd made Halloween costumes and birthday cakes and had attended every school play and soccer game. Marcus had talked about my strength after Gerald's death, how I'd learned to live alone without complaint, how I'd maintained my independence and dignity even as age began to limit what I could do. It all sounded lovely, Angela reported. Everyone cried at the appropriate moments and shared memories that painted me as a devoted wife, loving mother, and kind friend. If I'd actually been dead, I would have been moved by the tributes. But I wasn't dead, and what interested me more was what Angela noticed in the quieter moments between the formal eulogies. The way Claire kept checking her phone during the service, the way Marcus seemed more concerned with the logistics of the estate than with his actual grief, the way both of them were already talking about the house and what would need to be done with it before the reception had even ended. The reception at my house was where things began to reveal themselves more clearly. Angela positioned herself strategically in the kitchen where she could observe and overhear without being intrusive. Claire and Marcus, she reported, had spent most of the event discussing my possessions with the casual efficiency of people inventorying a storage unit rather than their mother's lifetime of accumulated belongings. Claire wanted the dining room table and the good china. Marcus was interested in Gerald's collection of first edition books, and they were already debating whether to sell the house immediately or rent it out for a while to maximize value. Nobody, Angela noted, seemed particularly interested in my personal items. The photo albums documenting their childhoods, the journals I'd kept sporadically over the years, the small watercolors I'd painted during the brief period when I'd taken art classes. These things were dismissed as clutter that would need to be dealt with eventually, but held no obvious monetary or sentimental value. Within 3 days of the funeral, Claire had hired an estate sale company. Within a week, my entire life was being tagged with prices and arranged on tables throughout my house for strangers to evaluate and purchase. And that's how I ended up standing in the shadows of my own hallway, watching an antique dealer offer $300 for my grandmother's wedding ring, while my children nodded eagerly and calculated their shares. The estate sale was scheduled for a Saturday, 10 days after my supposed death. Angela drove me to my own house before dawn, parking a block away so nobody would recognize her car. I slipped in through the back door using the key I'd kept, moving through rooms I'd lived in for more than 40 years, but that now felt like a museum of my own life. Everything was different. Furniture had been rearranged to create better flow for shoppers. My personal photographs had been taken down and stored in boxes marked family keepsakes. Price tags hung from lamps and vases and the grandfather clock Gerald had inherited from his father. I found a position in the hallway between the living room and the kitchen where I could see most of what was happening without being easily visible myself. I wore a wig Angela had purchased for me, gray but styled differently than my usual shortcut, And I dressed in clothes I'd bought specifically for this purpose so nobody would recognize my usual wardrobe. I looked like exactly what I was trying to be. An elderly woman who could have been anyone's grandmother browsing an estate sale out of curiosity or the hope of finding a bargain. The sale started at 8 in the morning, and by 8:15 there were 30 people moving through my house with the focused intensity of serious bargain hunters. I watched strangers handle my things, commenting on their quality or lack thereof, negotiating prices with Claire, who'd positioned herself near the front door to process payments. A woman in her 40s bought my collection of vintage cookbooks for $12, telling her companion they'd be perfect for her shabby chic kitchen aesthetic. A young couple debated whether my wedding china would work with their modern apartment before deciding it was too traditional for their taste. An elderly man with kind eyes purchased Gerald's woodworking tools, telling Claire he was sorry for her loss, and that her father must have been a skilled craftsman judging by the quality of the equipment. That last exchange was the only moment where Claire showed any real emotion. She corrected him gently. It was my mother who passed, not my father. He died 4 years ago. The man apologized for his confusion, and Claire assured him it was fine before moving on to the next customer. But I'd seen her face in that moment, seen the flash of something that might have been actual grief before the transaction continued. It wasn't enough though. It wasn't nearly enough to balance against what I was witnessing. Marcus arrived around 10, clearly having slept late despite the early start time. He moved through the house with coffee in hand, checking on prices and occasionally pulling Claire aside to discuss whether they were selling things too cheaply. I overheard him arguing that Gerald's book collection should have been appraised professionally before being offered at the estate sale, that first editions could be worth thousands and they were practically giving them away at $20 each. Claire pointed out that having them appraised would have delayed the sale by weeks, and she wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. They compromised by pulling a few titles they thought might be valuable and agreeing to sell the rest. By noon, roughly half of my possessions had been sold to strangers who would never know anything about the woman who'd owned them first. The dining room table where I'd served thousands of meals went to a young family for $400. My grandmother's wedding ring, the one that had survived wars and the Depression and had been passed down to me with instructions to give it to Claire someday, sold to a dealer for $300 after minimal negotiation. The watercolors I'd painted were in a box marked free stuff near the front door, considered too amateur to even warrant the $1 or $2 they might have fetched. What broke me wasn't the monetary value or lack thereof. It was the casual dismissal of everything these objects represented. Each item in this house had a story, a moment in time when it had meant something to someone. The cookbook collection had belonged to Gerald's mother, and had taught me to make the pot roast he loved. The wedding china had been a gift from my parents who'd saved for months to give us something beautiful to start our marriage. The watercolors had been painted during the year after Gerald died when I was trying to find ways to make beauty out of grief. None of that mattered to the people buying them. They were just objects stripped of context and meaning, reduced to their market value or lack thereof. But I stayed hidden, watching and learning. I needed to see it all. Needed to understand exactly what my death meant to the people I'd spent my life loving. Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard Claire and Marcus talking in the kitchen, thinking they were alone though I was just around the corner in the hallway. Claire was complaining about the crowds, about the strangers tracking dirt through the house, about how exhausting the whole process was. Marcus was calculating numbers on his phone, estimating how much they'd made so far, and how much more they might make if they ran the sale again tomorrow with reduced prices on remaining items. Then Claire said something that made my breath catch in my throat. I just want this over with. I know we're supposed to feel sad, but honestly, Marcus, I mostly just feel relieved. She'd been declining for years, getting more isolated, more difficult to deal with. At least now we don't have to worry about her anymore. Marcus made a non-committal sound that might have been agreement. Then he said, we should probably feel worse about that than we do. But yeah, it's a relief. She had a good life, and 4 years after Dad died she was just kind of marking time anyway. At least this way it was quick and she didn't end up in a nursing home draining the estate to pay for care. I stood in my hallway, invisible in plain sight, and felt something inside me shatter into pieces too small to ever repair. This was what I'd wanted to know, what I'd faked my death to discover. The truth about how my children actually felt about me. And the truth was so much worse than I'd imagined. I wasn't mourned. I was a problem solved and obligation fulfilled. a drain on resources that had finally been closed. They were relieved that I was dead. The estate sale continued for another 3 hours. I watched as more of my life was dismantled and distributed to strangers, as my children negotiated prices and made small talk with buyers and slowly liquidated everything that had made this house a home. By 6 in the evening, the house was mostly empty. Furniture remained because it hadn't sold, but all the small personal items, all the things that had decorated surfaces and filled drawers and made rooms feel lived in were gone. The house looked like what it would become: a vacant property to be cleaned and staged and sold to whoever offered the best price. Claire and Marcus ordered pizza for dinner, eating it straight from the box while sitting on the living room floor since the dining room table was gone. They seemed tired but satisfied, the kind of tiredness that comes after completing an unpleasant but necessary task. I heard them discussing timeline when they could get the house listed, how quickly they thought it might sell given the neighborhood and the current market conditions. They talked about splitting the proceeds 50-50, about what they'd each do with their share. Claire wanted to redo her kitchen. Marcus wanted to invest his portion and maybe buy a rental property in California. Not once did they talk about me, about memories in this house, about what it meant to finally close this chapter of their family history. I should have walked away then, should have slipped out the back door and returned to Angela's house and begun whatever came next in this absurd plan I'd set in motion. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped out of the shadows and into the living room where my children sat eating pizza in my empty house. The looks on their faces when they saw me would have been comical if the situation weren't so devastating. Claire's mouth literally fell open, pizza slice suspended halfway to her lips. Marcus dropped his slice entirely, sauce splattering on the hardwood floor I'd refinished 10 years ago. They stared at me as if I were a ghost, which I suppose in a way I was. The ghost of the mother they thought they'd buried, returned to haunt them with the truth of their own callousness. "Hello, Claire." "Hello, Marcus," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I imagine you're surprised to see me." The silence that followed my greeting stretched so long I began to wonder if they'd both gone into some kind of shock. Claire recovered first, scrambling to her feet with a coordination that suggested pure adrenaline overriding rational thought. Her pizza slice fell to the floor beside Marcus's, creating matching splashes of red sauce that looked almost artistic against the pale wood. "Mom." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, as if she didn't trust her own perception. "Is that really you?" "Yes, it's really me." I stepped further into the room, removing the gray wig I'd been wearing and setting it on the empty mantel where family photos used to sit. "I'm not dead, as you can see. I've been very much alive this entire time, watching everything unfold from a safe distance." Marcus had gone completely pale, his naturally tan complexion draining to an unhealthy gray that made him look genuinely ill. He stood up slowly, his hands shaking as he brushed pizza crumbs from his jeans. "I don't understand. We had a funeral. Angela Morrison called and said you died of a heart attack. There were paramedics and a death pronouncement and we buried you." "You didn't bury me," I corrected gently. "You had a memorial service with an empty urn because I'm not actually cremated. I'm standing right here in front of you, very much alive and very much aware of everything that's happened over the past 10 days. Claire's shock was rapidly transforming into something else. Anger, maybe, or the defensive outrage of someone caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing. "You faked your own death? Mom, do you have any idea how insane that is? Do you know what you've put us through?" "I believe I do, yes. I watched your grief at the funeral, which Angela was kind enough to report back to me in detail. I watched this estate sale from the hallway where I've been standing for most of the day. I watched you sell my possessions to strangers for whatever price you could get. And I heard your conversation about 20 minutes ago, the one where you both agreed you were relieved I was dead because I'd become too much of an inconvenience." The color that had drained from Marcus's face now flooded back in a deep red flush of shame or anger or both. "You were spying on us? You let us think you were dead just so you could spy on private conversations? I let you think I was dead so I could see the truth. And I did see it, didn't I? I saw exactly what my death meant to both of you. Relief. Freedom from obligation. Access to an inheritance you could spend on kitchen renovations and rental properties. Not grief, not loss, not even particularly deep sadness. Just relief that the burden of an aging mother had been lifted from your shoulders." Claire's anger solidified into something harder and more defensive. "That's not fair. We loved you. We mourned you. Just because we also had practical conversations about the estate doesn't mean we weren't genuinely sad. Were you though? I moved closer to where they stood, noticing how they both instinctively stepped back, as if I were something dangerous rather than the woman who'd raised them. Because what I heard didn't sound like people wrestling with grief while handling necessary logistics. It sounded like people who were glad the inconvenience was over. Marcus found his voice finally, and it came out sharp with accusation. You have no right to judge us. You put us through hell. We thought you were dead, Mom. We grieved for you. We made arrangements and dealt with lawyers and spent the last week and a half believing our mother was gone. And now you just show up and act like we're the villains? You are not villains, I said quietly. You're just people who stopped seeing me as a person somewhere along the way. I became a name on your to-do list, an obligation to check off, a future problem you knew you'd eventually have to handle. And when you thought that problem had solved itself through my convenient death, you were relieved. That's the truth, isn't it? Claire's eyes filled with tears, though I couldn't tell if they were tears of genuine emotion or frustrated anger at being confronted with uncomfortable truths. This is crazy. You're being completely unfair. We had an estate sale because that's what you do when someone dies. We discussed selling the house because you're not using it anymore. We tried to handle everything responsibly and efficiently, and now you're punishing us for not performing grief in whatever way you think we should have? I'm not punishing you. I'm simply showing you what I learned. That my life meant very little to either of you beyond its eventual monetary value. That you couldn't wait 3 weeks before selling off everything I owned. That my grandmother's wedding ring, which I'd always intended to give to you, Claire, was worth $300 to a stranger and apparently worth nothing at all to you since you sold it without hesitation. Claire's face crumpled at that, and for the first time I saw something that looked like genuine remorse break through her defensiveness. I didn't know you wanted me to have Grandma's ring. You never said anything about it. I shouldn't have had to say anything. It was your great-grandmother's ring, Claire. It's been in our family for nearly a century. The fact that you sold it at an estate sale for less than you'd pay for a nice dinner tells me everything I need to know about how much family history matters to you. Marcus had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up with the kind of calm rationality he probably used in business meetings. Okay, let's everyone just take a breath here. Mom, what you did was deeply wrong and honestly pretty cruel. But you're right that we could have been more thoughtful about handling your things. So maybe we can all agree that everyone made mistakes here and try to move forward. Move forward to what exactly? I looked between my 2 children. These people I'd carried in my body and raised into adults and loved with every fiber of my being for their entire lives. Move forward to the same relationship we had before, where you visit once a month when you need something and call on Sundays out of obligation. Move forward to me being invisible again, just waiting around until I actually do die and you can have this conversation for real? That's not fair, Claire protested. We didn't make you invisible. You chose to be alone. After Dad died, you pulled away from everyone. We invited you to things and you always said you were fine, that you didn't need anything, that you wanted us to live our own lives. What were we supposed to do, force you to spend time with us? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized with sudden clarity that she actually believed what she was saying. In Claire's mind, my independence had been a choice I'd made rather than a gradual abandonment I'd experienced. She'd rewritten our history to absolve herself of guilt, and perhaps she'd done it so thoroughly that she couldn't see the truth anymore even when it was standing directly in front of her. You're right that I told you I was fine, I said slowly. I told you that because I didn't want to be a burden, because I didn't want to impose on your busy lives, because I thought that's what good mothers did. They raised independent children and then stepped back and let them live without interference. But independence shouldn't mean invisibility, Claire. It shouldn't mean that my death is primarily an inconvenience to be managed rather than a loss to be mourned. Marcus checked his phone, a gesture so instinctive and unconscious that I don't think he even realized he'd done it. Mom, I think we need to have this conversation when everyone is calmer. This has been an incredibly emotional day, and I don't think any of us are in the right headspace to have a productive discussion about family dynamics. There it was again. The deflection, the suggestion that feelings were things to be managed and scheduled rather than experienced and expressed. Marcus had learned this from his father, who'd been a master at avoiding difficult conversations by suggesting they'd be better handled later, at a more appropriate time, when everyone could be rational about it. Later never came, of course. The conversations got postponed indefinitely until whatever had sparked them faded into resentment that got buried under years of polite distance. I'm not interested in productive discussions, Marcus. I'm interested in the truth, which is what I got today. I know exactly where I stand with both of you now. I'm a financial asset to be liquidated when I die, nothing more. All the years of raising you and caring for you and putting your needs before mine added up to relief when you thought I was gone. That's the truth, and no amount of rational discussion at a more appropriate time is going to change it. Claire wiped at her eyes, smearing mascara across her cheeks in dark streaks that made her look older and more tired than her 46 years. What do you want from us, Mom? Do you want us to apologize? Fine. I'm sorry we didn't handle things the way you wanted. I'm sorry we had an estate sale. I'm sorry we sold Grandma's ring. I'm sorry we talked about being relieved. What else do you want? You want us to pretend we're devastated? You want us to perform grief that meets your standards? I want you to actually feel something, I said, hearing my voice crack for the first time. I want my death to matter to you beyond the inconvenience it causes and the inheritance it provides. I want you to miss me, not the idea of me or the obligation of me, but the actual person I am. And the fact that I had to fake my own death to realize you don't see me as a person anymore is the saddest thing that's ever happened to me, including losing your father. The three of us stood in my empty living room, the space between us filled with years of accumulated distance and disappointment. I could see them struggling with what to say, how to respond to accusations that were fundamentally true but impossible to acknowledge without admitting something terrible about themselves. Claire opened her mouth several times to speak, then closed it again as if testing and rejecting various responses before committing to any of them. Finally, Marcus said, I think you should leave, Mom. This is still technically your house until the estate is fully settled, but I think we all need space to process what just happened. Can you stay with this Angela person who helped you with this whole scheme? Yes, I can stay with Angela. I picked up the gray wig from the mantel, holding it in my hands like a strange artifact from someone else's life. I have a guest room in her basement where I've been living for the past 3 weeks, watching my own funeral and estate sale unfold while trying to understand how I became so irrelevant to the people I love most in the world. You're not irrelevant, Claire said, but the words came out automatic and unconvincing, the kind of thing people say because it's expected rather than because they believe it. You're our mother. We love you. Do you? I looked at her directly, searching her face for something genuine beneath the defensiveness and confusion. Because love is supposed to mean something, Claire. It's supposed to be more than just saying the right words while living in a way that contradicts them. Love is supposed to involve actually caring about someone's life, not just what you inherit when they die. I walked toward the front door, passing through rooms that had been stripped of everything that made them recognizable. The house was a shell now, empty of both possessions and meaning. At the door, I turned back to look at my children one more time. They stood together. In the living room, united by their shared shock and probably already beginning to construct the narrative they'd tell themselves about what had happened. Their crazy mother who'd faked her death and spied on them, and wasn't being fair or reasonable about normal estate procedures. There are letters for both of you in my bedroom on the dresser. I wrote them before I staged my death, thinking they'd be the last words I ever got to share with you. Read them or don't, that's your choice. But everything in those letters is still true, even though I'm not actually dead. I loved being your mother. I loved every moment of raising you, even the hard ones. I'm just sad that somewhere along the way you stopped loving me back in any way that actually matters. I left before either of them could respond, pulling the door closed behind me on a house that was no longer my home, and a relationship with my children that perhaps had been dead long before I'd pretended to be. Angela was waiting in her car at the end of the block, exactly where we'd arranged. She took one look at my face when I slid into the passenger seat, and didn't ask any questions, just reached over and squeezed my hand with the kind of silent understanding that meant more than any words could have. We drove back to her house in silence, and I stared out the window at the familiar streets of a town I'd lived in for 50 years but that suddenly felt foreign and strange, as if I'd become a ghost haunting someone else's life. The basement apartment felt like a refuge when we arrived, a space that belonged to no one and therefore welcomed anyone. Angela made tea while I sat at the small kitchen table, and tried to process everything that had happened. The confrontation with Claire and Marcus, the words we'd thrown at each other, the impossible distance between what I'd hoped they'd feel, and what they actually felt. All of it circled in my mind like water going down a drain, pulling me towards something dark and deep that I wasn't ready to face yet. They were relieved I was dead, I said aloud, testing the words to see if speaking them would make them less terrible. They literally said they were glad it was over quickly so I wouldn't drain the estate paying for nursing home care. That's what my life meant to them, Angela. I was a future expense they were grateful to avoid. Angela set a mug of chamomile tea in front of me, then sat down across the table with her own cup. People are very good at disappointing us when we give them the opportunity. Did they say anything else after you revealed yourself? They defended themselves mostly. Said I was being unfair, that having an estate sale was normal, that I'd made myself invisible by being too independent. Claire cried, but I think she was crying because she got caught rather than because she actually felt bad about what she'd done. Marcus wanted to schedule a time to have a rational discussion about family dynamics, as if this is something that can be resolved with bullet points and action items. Angela sipped her tea thoughtfully. What are you going to do now? The question was simple but impossibly complicated. What was I going to do now? I couldn't undo what I'd done or unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't go back to the life I'd had before, pretending I didn't know what my children really thought about me, performing the role of contented mother while slowly fading into irrelevance. But I also couldn't move forward into some unknown future without confronting the reality that the family I believed in didn't actually exist in any meaningful way. I don't know, I admitted. The plan was just to fake my death and see what happened. I didn't think beyond that because I didn't want to imagine what I'd do if the worst-case scenario turned out to be true. And now it has, and I have no idea what comes next. Angela reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers. The worst-case scenario is never finding out the truth, Dorothy. Living the rest of your life believing in relationships that don't exist, dying for real someday, and being mourned by people who are secretly relieved. At least now you know. And knowing the truth, however painful, gives you the power to make real choices about how you want to spend whatever time you have left. She was right, of course. As devastating as the truth was, it was still preferable to the comfortable lies I'd been living with. I'd spent 4 years since Gerald's death telling myself that Claire and Marcus were just busy, that their distance was normal for adult children with their own lives, that I was being unreasonable to expect more frequent contact or deeper connection. Now I knew better. Their distance wasn't circumstantial, it was intentional. Or if not intentional, then at least reflective of genuine indifference dressed up as filial duty. The next morning, I woke early in the basement apartment and lay in bed watching pale October sunlight filter through the high windows near the ceiling. Today was Sunday, which meant Marcus would normally call me at 7 in the evening for our weekly 7-minute conversation about nothing in particular. Except there would be no call today because Marcus thought I was dead. Or rather, he'd thought I was dead until yesterday when I'd appeared in my living room like a particularly inconvenient ghost. I wondered if he'd returned to California yet, or if he was still in town dealing with the aftermath of my resurrection. I wondered what he and Claire were telling people, how they were explaining that their dead mother had turned out to be alive after all. Sorry for the confusion, she was just testing us and we failed. Sorry about the funeral, apparently she wanted to see if we actually loved her and the answer is not really. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so crushingly sad. Angela knocked softly on my door around 9, carrying a plate of toast and scrambled eggs. You need to eat something. Grief burns a lot of calories even when you're grieving relationships that are still technically alive. I sat up in bed and accepted the plate, suddenly realizing I was actually hungry despite the emotional turmoil of the previous day. Thank you for this. For all of this, really. I don't know what I would have done without your help. You would have figured something out. You're more resourceful than you give yourself credit for, Dorothy. Angela sat on the edge of the bed, watching me eat with the satisfied attention of someone who believes feeding people is a fundamental act of care. Have you thought about what you're going to do next? Are you going to reveal yourself publicly, or let Claire and Marcus explain the situation? I haven't thought that far ahead. Part of me wants to just disappear for real this time, move somewhere they'd never think to look for me and start over completely. But that feels cowardly somehow, like I'd be letting them off the hook too easily. Angela considered this for a moment. You could also do something much more interesting. You could actually live the life you want instead of the life you think you're supposed to want. You're 72 years old with good health, comfortable savings, and absolutely no obligations to anyone anymore. That's not a punishment, Dorothy. That's freedom. The word hung in the air between us, full of possibilities I'd never seriously considered. Freedom. What did that even mean for a woman my age? I'd spent my entire adult life defined by relationships and responsibilities. Wife, mother, grandmother, caretaker, volunteer, friend. All of those roles had shaped my daily existence, determined my priorities, structured my time and energy around other people's needs and expectations. The idea of simply doing what I wanted, answering to no one, building a life based entirely on my own preferences rather than my perceived obligations, was both thrilling and terrifying. What would I even do with that kind of freedom? I asked Angela. I don't know who I am outside of being a wife and mother. Those were the main roles that gave my life meaning. Then maybe it's time to find out who else you could be. Angela stood up from the bed, collecting my empty plate. You've got time and resources and now complete liberation from family obligations since you've definitively proven those obligations were pretty one-sided anyway. That's not nothing, Dorothy. That's actually a tremendous gift even if it came wrapped in painful truth. After Angela left, I sat in the small apartment and tried to imagine what a free life might look like. No more waiting by the phone for Claire's monthly calls that never came. No more cooking elaborate Sunday dinners that Marcus never flew in to eat. No more volunteering for committees I didn't care about just to fill time and create the illusion of purposeful activity. No more pretending my life was full when it was actually just full of waiting for other people to need or notice me. What did I actually want? The question was harder to answer than it should have been. I'd stopped asking it decades ago, somewhere around the time Claire started kindergarten and my identity as an individual woman got completely subsumed into my identity as Gerald's wife and Claire and Marcus's mother. My wants had become synonymous with my family's wants. I'd wanted whatever would make them happy, whatever would support their dreams and smooth their paths through life. My own desires had been relegated to the margins, small hobbies pursued in spare moments but never taken seriously or developed fully. I thought about the watercolor class I'd mentioned to Claire, the one she dismissed with a distracted, "That's nice," while staring at her phone. I'd actually been quite interested in that class, had picked up the community center catalog, and circled the dates and imagined spending Saturday mornings learning to capture light and color on paper. But after Claire's non-reaction, I'd talked myself out of it. Too frivolous for a woman my age, too self-indulgent to spend money and time on something that served no practical purpose. Better to save the registration fee, and use the time to clean out the attic or organize the garage or perform any of the endless maintenance tasks that kept a house functioning but contributed nothing to joy or growth. I picked up my phone from the nightstand, Googling watercolor classes in the area. There was still space in the Saturday morning session that started in 2 weeks. 8 weeks of instruction covering basic techniques, color theory, and outdoor landscape painting. The registration fee was $140, approximately half of what Claire had gotten for selling my grandmother's wedding ring. I registered for the class before I could talk myself out of it, entering my credit card information with hands that trembled slightly from the audacity of doing something purely for my own pleasure. It felt rebellious in a way that was completely ridiculous for a 72-year-old woman, but also genuinely thrilling. This was mine. Not approved by my children or connected to my role as wife or mother, just something Dorothy Whitmore wanted to do because it interested her. That small act of defiance opened something in me. Over the next few days, I began making lists of other things I'd always been vaguely interested in but never pursued seriously. Travel, especially international travel to places Gerald had never wanted to visit. He'd been content with occasional trips to visit relatives or beach vacations that required minimal planning, and stayed firmly within comfortable American experiences. But I'd always wondered about Italy, about walking through ancient ruins and eating pasta in small family restaurants, and seeing the art I'd only known from books and museum postcards. What was stopping me from going now? Money wasn't the issue. Gerald and I had saved diligently throughout our marriage, and his life insurance plus my own retirement savings meant I was actually quite comfortable financially. The house was paid off, I had no debts, and my monthly expenses were minimal. I could afford to travel extensively if I chose to, could afford to take classes and pursue hobbies and generally live much more expansively than I had been. But I'd been holding back, saving money for some undefined future emergency, or to preserve the inheritance I'd someday leave to Claire and Marcus. Leaving them more money so they could have an even bigger estate sale, I thought bitterly. Angela encouraged my emerging plans with the enthusiasm of a co-conspirator. She suggested we take a trip together. Just two widows exploring parts of the world we'd always wanted to see, but had sacrificed for family responsibilities. We spent evenings with travel guides and websites open on my laptop, planning an itinerary through Italy that hit all the places I'd dreamed about. Rome, Florence, Venice, the smaller towns in Tuscany that looked like paintings themselves. 6 weeks, we decided. Long enough to actually experience the country rather than just rushing through tourist highlights. The planning felt like building a parallel life, one that existed independently of the family drama I'd created. Claire called twice during this period, but I let the calls go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to her yet, wasn't ready to have whatever conversation she thought we needed to have. Her voicemails were careful and neutral, asking if I was okay and saying they needed to discuss the estate situation now that I was alive after all. No apology, no acknowledgement of what I'd overheard them saying, just logistical concern about legal and financial complications. Marcus sent emails instead of calling, which was more his style. The emails were longer than his typical communication, multiple paragraphs explaining why my actions had been hurtful and unfair, and requesting a family meeting to work through everything in a constructive manner. He suggested family therapy, which struck me as simultaneously thoughtful and completely missing the point. Therapy might help us communicate more effectively, but it wouldn't change the fundamental reality that my children viewed me as an obligation, rather than a person they genuinely wanted in their lives. I responded to neither the calls nor the emails. I wasn't ghosting them exactly, more like giving us all space to sit with the uncomfortable truths that had been exposed. And honestly, I was enjoying the freedom of not having to manage their feelings or perform emotional labor to make them feel better about their own behavior. For the first time in my adult life, I was simply doing what I wanted without considering how it would affect anyone else, and the selfishness of it was intoxicating. 3 weeks after my dramatic resurrection in the living room, I received a certified letter from Patricia Hendricks, my attorney. Claire and Marcus had apparently contacted her about the complicated legal situation my fake death had created. The life insurance claim would need to be reversed, the estate proceedings would need to be stopped, various financial institutions would need to be notified that I was alive. It was a mess, Patricia noted in her letter, but a manageable mess assuming I was willing to cooperate with the cleanup process. I called Patricia from Angela's kitchen, and we had a long conversation about what needed to happen next. She was surprisingly non-judgmental about the whole situation, treating it as an interesting legal puzzle rather than the insane stunt it actually was. We discussed options for moving forward, including whether I wanted to transfer the house to Claire and Marcus immediately or retain ownership myself. We talked about updating my will to reflect my current feelings about my children's inheritance. We addressed practical matters with a calm professionalism that made me remember why I'd hired her in the first place. At the end of our conversation, Patricia asked me a question that felt more personal than professional. Dorothy, what do you actually want to happen here? Not what you think you should want or what would be easiest for everyone else, but what would make you feel like this whole difficult experience was worth it? I thought about that question for a long time after we hung up. What did I want? Justice felt too grand and vindictive. Reconciliation felt impossible given what I now knew about how my children truly felt about me. An apology would be meaningless unless it came with genuine change, and I had no faith that Claire and Marcus were capable of the kind of self-reflection that would produce authentic transformation rather than performative remorse. What I wanted, I finally realized, was to stop waiting for them to see me. I'd spent years hoping that if I was patient enough, understanding enough, undemanding enough, my children would eventually recognize my value and choose to maintain a real relationship with me. But that hope had been keeping me trapped in a pattern of disappointment and diminishing expectations. The fake death had shown me definitively that waiting was pointless. They weren't going to suddenly wake up and realize they missed me or valued me, or wanted me in their lives beyond obligatory contact. And continuing to organize my life around that impossible hope was just another form of self-erasure. I wanted to live. Really live. Not the half-life I'd been existing in since Gerald died. I wanted to take the watercolor class and go to Italy with Angela and maybe volunteer for causes I actually cared about rather than committees I joined out of social obligation. I wanted to make decisions based on what brought me joy rather than what would make me seem like a good mother or a respectable widow, or any other role that required me to minimize myself. I wanted, in short, to matter to myself even if I didn't matter to anyone else. The Italy trip was scheduled for early November, just 3 weeks away. Angela and I had purchased tickets, booked hotels, planned our itinerary with the excited attention to detail that made the whole adventure feel real rather than hypothetical. I was actually going to do this, going to get on a plane and spend 6 weeks on another continent doing exactly what I wanted to do. The realization made me feel simultaneously terrified and more alive than I'd felt in years. 2 days before I was supposed to leave for Italy, Claire showed up at Angela's house. I watched from the basement window as she got out of her car and stood on the front walk, clearly nervous about whatever conversation she'd come to have. Angela answered the door and spoke with her briefly before coming downstairs to ask if I wanted to see my daughter. I almost said no. It would have been easier to leave for Italy without this confrontation, to maintain the distance that had grown between us over the past month. But Angela was right that avoiding difficult conversations just prolonged suffering rather than preventing it. I needed to face Claire one more time, not for her sake but for mine. I needed to set boundaries and expectations that would allow me to move forward, without the constant background hope that things might somehow change. Claire looked tired when Angela showed her into the basement apartment. There were dark circles under her eyes and new lines around her mouth that aged her in a way I hadn't noticed before. She sat in the chair I offered but perched on the edge as if ready to flee at any moment. Marcus flew back to California, she said without preamble. He said he couldn't deal with this situation, and that you and I needed to work it out ourselves. So here I am trying to work it out. I sat across from her at the small kitchen table, studying the face of the daughter I'd carried for 9 months and raised for 18 years before sending out into the world. She looked like my mother, a resemblance that had always pleased me, but that now felt like a painful reminder of generational patterns. My mother had also felt invisible in her later years, had also struggled with adult children who were too busy for more than performative contact. I'd promised myself I'd do better with my own children, would maintain closer relationships built on genuine connection rather than obligation. Apparently I'd failed at that promise as completely as my mother had. What did you want to work out, Claire? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She twisted her hands together in her lap, a nervous gesture she'd had since childhood. I wanted to apologize. Not because Marcus thinks I should or because it's the right thing to do, but because I've spent the past month thinking about what you said. About being relieved you were dead. And you were right, Mom. I was relieved, and that's a terrible thing to feel about your own mother. The admission surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness or attempts at justification, not this raw acknowledgement. Go on. After you left that day, Marcus and I got into a huge fight about everything. About you, about how we'd handled the estate, about what kind of people we'd become. He wanted to treat it like you'd played some cruel prank on us, like we were the victims in this situation. But I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd said about becoming invisible. About how we turned you into an obligation instead of a person. Claire's eyes filled with tears, and unlike the last time I'd seen her cry, these seemed genuine rather than defensive. I don't know when it happened, Mom. When I stopped seeing you as someone I wanted to spend time with and started seeing you as someone I had to check on out of duty. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was just this gradual shift where my own life got so busy and complicated that anything outside of immediate responsibilities felt like extra weight I couldn't carry. I understand that, I said carefully. Adult children have their own lives and priorities. That's natural and healthy. What's not healthy is the pretense that we have a real relationship when we actually just have a schedule of obligatory contact that neither of us enjoys. Claire flinched at that, but she didn't argue. You're right. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I sold Grandma's ring without thinking about what it meant. I'm sorry I had an estate sale 3 days after your funeral. I'm sorry I was relieved instead of devastated. I'm sorry I turned you into someone I took care of instead of someone I cared about. The apology was everything I'd wanted to hear a month ago. But now, sitting across from my daughter in a borrowed apartment while preparing to leave for Italy, I realized that apologies weren't actually what I needed. They were just words that acknowledged harm without necessarily changing anything. What I needed was to stop organizing my life around the hope that my children would suddenly transform into people who genuinely valued me. I appreciate you saying that, Claire. I really do. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going to wait anymore for you to decide I'm worth your time and attention. I spent 4 years after your father died telling myself that you and Marcus were just busy, That once things settled down you'd visit more and call more and actually want to be part of my life. But things never settle down. There's always something more important, more urgent, more worthy of your limited time and energy. And I'm done pretending that's going to change. Claire looked stricken. So what are you saying? That you don't want a relationship with me anymore? I'm saying that I'm going to live my life based on what actually brings me joy, rather than what I hope might happen if I'm patient enough. I'm leaving for Italy in 2 days. I'll be gone for 6 weeks, traveling with Angela and taking watercolor classes and eating too much pasta and generally doing everything I want to do without checking with anyone first. When I come back, I'm selling the house and moving into a smaller place that suits me better. I'm going to volunteer for causes I care about and take classes that interest me and spend time with people who actually want to spend time with me. And where do Marcus and I fit into that plan? Claire's voice was small, almost childlike. Wherever you choose to fit. If you want to call me because you genuinely want to talk, not because it's Sunday and you feel obligated, then call me. If you want to visit because you miss me and enjoy my company, not because you think you should check on the elderly mother, then visit. But I'm not going to keep tracking how often we talk or measuring whether you care about me based on frequency of contact. I'm just going to live my life, and you're welcome to be part of it if you want to be. The boundaries I was setting felt simultaneously harsh and liberating. I wasn't cutting my children out of my life completely, but I was also refusing to maintain the fiction that we had a close relationship just because biology said we should. They could be as involved or uninvolved as they chose, but I was done pretending their minimal contact was enough, or making myself smaller to accommodate their indifference. Claire sat with this for a long moment, tears streaming down her face in a way that suggested genuine emotion rather than manipulative performance. I want to be part of your life, Mom. Not out of obligation, but because I actually do love you even if I've been terrible at showing it. I know I can't undo the past month or the past 4 years, but I'd like to try to do better going forward. Then do better, I said simply. Not through grand gestures or promises about how things will be different, just through actual consistent effort. Call me when you're thinking about me. Visit when you want to spend time together. Show interest in my life beyond checking that I'm still alive and not falling apart. Treat me like someone you actually want to know rather than someone you're obligated to monitor. I can do that. Claire wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar from her childhood that my heart clenched despite everything. Will you call me from Italy? Let me know you arrived safely? I'll send you postcards, I offered. Real paper postcards with pictures of wherever I am and notes about what I'm doing. You can collect them and when I get back we can have dinner and I'll tell you about the trip in person. If you want to hear about it. I do want to hear about it. Claire stood up from the chair, hesitating as if unsure whether a hug would be welcome. I let her make the decision, and after a moment she crossed the small kitchen and wrapped her arms around me in an embrace that felt different from the perfunctory hugs we'd exchanged at holidays and birthdays. This one had weight and intention, an acknowledgement of both the damage that had been done and the tentative possibility of repair. After Claire left, I sat alone in the apartment and felt something shift inside me. The conversation hadn't resolved everything, hadn't magically transformed our relationship into the closeness I'd always wanted. But it had established something more important than closeness. It had established honesty. We both knew where we stood now, knew what the relationship actually was rather than what we'd been pretending it should be. And that truth, however uncomfortable, created space for something authentic to potentially grow. Italy was everything I'd hoped it would be and more than I'd imagined possible. Angela and I spent 6 weeks wandering through ancient cities and small hill towns, eating remarkable food and drinking wine that tasted like sunshine and history. I took watercolor classes from an expatriate American artist living in Florence who taught me to see light differently, to capture not just what things looked like, but how they felt. I painted terrible pictures of the Duomo and slightly less terrible pictures of the Tuscan countryside. And I didn't care that they were amateur efforts because they were mine. The postcards I sent to Claire were honest snapshots of my days. A picture of the Spanish Steps with a note about getting delightfully lost in Rome's winding streets. A sunset over the Arno River with observations about how water reflects light differently in different cities. A small church in a village whose name I couldn't pronounce with descriptions of the old woman who'd invited us in and shared her family's history through broken English and generous gestures. I didn't know if Claire would care about any of it, but I wrote the postcards anyway because they helped me process my own experience. When I returned in mid-December, I found that Claire had kept every postcard. She'd even put them in a small album, arranging them chronologically with the envelopes they'd arrived in. We met for dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to before, and for the first time in years we had a conversation that felt genuinely two-sided. She asked questions about Italy and actually listened to my answers. She told me about struggles at work and with her teenagers, not looking for me to solve anything but just sharing her life the way people do when they trust each other enough to be honest. It wasn't perfect. One dinner didn't undo years of distance, and it didn't mean our relationship was suddenly repaired. But it was a start. A genuine start built on truth rather than obligation. Over the following months we had more dinners. Claire came to see my new apartment, a 2-bedroom condo that suited me perfectly with its manageable size and proximity to the community center, where I now taught beginning watercolor classes twice a week. She even attended one of my classes, painting alongside other students with more enthusiasm than natural talent. Marcus was slower to come around. He sent occasional emails that were longer than his previous 7-minute phone calls, but still maintained a certain emotional distance. He visited once, 6 months after my return from Italy, and we had an awkward but honest conversation about how we'd both contributed to the deterioration of our relationship. He'd made assumptions about what I needed and wanted without actually asking me. I'd been too proud to admit I was lonely and had needed more support after Gerald died. We agreed to try to do better, though neither of us was certain what better would look like. The house sold eventually, and I split the proceeds with Claire and Marcus as I'd always planned to do. But I changed my will to reflect my new understanding of inheritance. Instead of leaving them everything when I died, I set up a trust that would distribute funds gradually over time and included significant donations to causes I cared about. Elder advocacy organizations, art programs for seniors, support services for widows navigating life after loss. I wanted my money to do some good in the world rather than just becoming another estate sale for my children to manage when I was actually gone. A year and a half after my fake death, I found myself sitting in Angela's garden on a warm June afternoon, working on a watercolor of her roses while she read beside me. We'd become closer than many sisters, bound together by shared experience and genuine affection, rather than biological obligation. She'd been right about everything. Faking my death had been the most absurd and painful way to discover the truth about my life, but knowing that truth had given me permission to actually live. I thought about the woman I'd been before, the one who'd sat at Claire's dinner table feeling invisible and irrelevant. That woman had believed her value was determined by how much her children needed her, how central she was to their lives. She'd measured her worth in phone calls that never came and visits that never happened, slowly shrinking herself down to fit the minimal space her children had allocated for her in their busy lives. The woman I'd become understood that her value wasn't dependent on anyone else's recognition or need. I mattered because I chose to matter to myself, because I filled my days with activities that brought me joy and connection with people who actually wanted to know me. I'd built a life that was genuinely mine rather than a life organized around waiting for other people to decide I was worth their time. Claire and I had dinner every couple of weeks now, real dinners where we talked about substantive things and actually listened to each other. Marcus called monthly. Conversations that sometimes lasted 30 minutes and covered topics beyond weather and work. It wasn't the close relationship I'd once imagined having with my adult children, but it was honest. And honesty, I'd learned, was worth more than performative closeness. Angela looked up from her book and smiled at me. That one's coming along nicely. The roses actually look like roses this time instead of pink blobs. I laughed, adding another layer of shadow to the petals. High praise coming from you. I'll have you know my students think I'm quite talented. Your students are very kind people who paid good money for your class and want to believe they're learning from an expert. But yes, you have gotten significantly better. Another year or two and you might even be genuinely good at this. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with conversation. Eventually Angela said, "Do you regret it? The whole elaborate fake death scheme?" I considered the question seriously, thinking back to that afternoon when I'd stood in my hallway watching my possessions be sold off and my children calculate their inheritance. The pain of that moment was still sharp when I let myself remember it fully. But the pain had also been the catalyst for everything good that had come after. "No," I said finally. It was insane and probably caused permanent damage to my relationship with my children and definitely traumatized them in ways they'll probably need therapy to process. But it also freed me from spending the rest of my life trapped in patterns that were slowly killing me. I matter now, Angela. I matter to myself in a way I never did before when I was constantly measuring my worth by how much other people needed or wanted me. That's the real gift then. Not what you learned about Claire and Marcus, but what you learned about yourself. She was right. The revelation that my children didn't value me the way I'd hoped had been devastating. But the discovery that I could value myself regardless had been transformative. I'd spent 72 years believing that my purpose was to serve others, to be useful and necessary and self-sacrificing. The fake death had shown me that nobody actually needs you to sacrifice yourself for them. They'll manage just fine without you, might even be relieved when you're gone. But that reality, while painful, was also deeply liberating. I finished the watercolor as the afternoon sun shifted lower in the sky, casting everything in golden light that made even Angela's ordinary suburban garden look magical. The painting wasn't perfect by any objective standard, but it captured something true about the moment. The play of light on petals, the depth of shadow under leaves, the particular quality of a June afternoon in a garden tended by someone who genuinely loved growing things. I signed it in the corner with my initials and the date, then held it up for Angela to see. What do you think? Worth framing? Absolutely. She took the painting from me, studying it with the serious attention she gave all my work. You've developed your own style, Dorothy. That's not easy to do. Most amateur painters just copy what they see in books or try to recreate photographs. But this is unmistakably yours. The compliment meant more than she probably realized. Having my own style, my own way of seeing and representing the world, felt like proof that I existed as an individual rather than just as someone's wife or mother or grandmother. I was Dorothy Whitmore, watercolor artist and terrible cook and enthusiastic traveler, an imperfect mother and person who'd once faked her own death to learn the truth about her life. All of those things messy and complicated and utterly my own. That evening I posted the watercolor on the small online gallery I'd started maintaining, a simple website where I shared my paintings and wrote brief essays about the process of learning to see the world as an artist. The audience was tiny, maybe 50 people who'd stumbled across it and decided to follow along, but they were my audience. People who'd chosen to pay attention to what I created because they found it interesting or beautiful or just pleasantly distracting. Their attention wasn't obligatory or biological, or based on any relationship beyond appreciation for the work itself. Claire commented on the post later that night, something she'd started doing regularly. The roses are beautiful, Mom. I love how you captured the way afternoon light changes colors. Makes me want to come sit in Angela's garden with you sometime. I smiled at the comment and typed back a response. You're welcome anytime. We usually paint on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons if you want to join us. Bring your own supplies though, I'm not sharing my good brushes. It was a small exchange, the kind of minor interaction that happened thousands of times daily across social media. But it represented something larger. A relationship that was slowly rebuilding itself on a foundation of genuine interest, rather than obligatory contact. Claire wanted to come paint with me not because she felt she should, but because she actually thought it sounded pleasant. And I'd invited her not because I was desperate for her attention, but because I genuinely enjoyed her company when she chose to show up authentically. The fake death had taught me that love without reciprocity is just another form of self-erasure. But it had also taught me that relationships could transform if both people were willing to be honest about what they actually were rather than what they were supposed to be. Claire and I would probably never have the close mother-daughter relationship I'd once imagined, but we could have something real. Something built on truth and mutual respect, and the willingness to show up for each other not out of obligation but out of genuine care. And if that was all I got from my elaborate resurrection, if the only thing that changed was learning to value myself regardless of whether anyone else did, then it had been worth it. Because the woman I'd become, the one who painted roses and traveled to Italy and taught watercolor classes and lived life on her own terms, was someone I actually liked. Someone I was proud to be. Someone who would be genuinely mourned when she actually died because she'd lived fully enough to leave a real mark on the world. I closed my laptop and looked around the small apartment that had become my sanctuary. Books I'd chosen because they interested me. Art supplies organized exactly how I wanted them. Furniture arranged for my comfort rather than to impress visitors. A life that was entirely mine. built deliberately and joyfully in the aftermath of discovering that the life I'd been living before wasn't actually life at all. Just existence, just waiting, just the slow fade into invisibility that I'd mistaken for normal aging. Not anymore though. Now I was visible, at least to myself. And that, I'd learned, was the only visibility that truly mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.